They called themselves the Iron Wolves, the most notorious motorcycle gang in West Texas. For months, they'd been terrorizing every diner and truck stop along Route 62 until they walked into Rosa's cafe and met Thomas Lightning McCall to them. He was just another 75-year-old rancher drinking his morning coffee, an easy target for their amusement. But when they mocked his worn leather holster and challenged him to draw, they made the deadliest stake of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Route 62 as it cut through the heart of West Texas, the asphalt shimming like a black river in the desert heat. Rosa's cafe stood as an oasis for travelers and local alike, its weathered sign creaking gently in the warm breeze that swept across the sprawling rangelands. For 40 years, Thomas McCall had started his mornings the same way, arriving precisely at sunrise, settling into his corner booth and savoring Rosa's coffee, while watching the world wake up through the diner's wide windows. His weathered Stetson hung on the rack by the door, and the leather holster at his hip had grown smooth from decades of wear, a remnant from his days as the fastest draw west of the Pozos. Maria Tez, who'd owned Rosa's cafe since inheriting it from her mother 15 years ago, wiped down the counter with practiced efficiency, stealing concerned glances at the highway. "More coffee, Mr. McCall," she called out, though his cup was still half full. The morning regulars had grown sparse lately, ever since the Iron Wolves had started claiming Route 62 as their territory. "Appreciated, Maria," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the quiet dignity that hadn't faded with age. "Seems awful quiet this morning." His blue eyes, still sharp despite his 75 years, scanned the nearly empty diner. Only Sarah Chen, the local school teacher, sat at the counter, her breakfast growing cold as she watched the highway with obvious unease. "Fourth morning this week," Sarah observed, her voice low. "They're getting bolder, riding through earlier and earlier." As if summoned by her words, the distant rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder, like approaching thunder on a clear day. Sheriff James Rodriguez entered, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. He nodded to Thomas, then settled onto a stool near Sarah. "Morning, folks," he said, accepting coffee from Maria. "Suppose you've heard about the Parker Ranch incident." Thomas wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, the silver rings on his fingers catching the morning light. "Jack mentioned something yesterday. Vandalism. That's putting it mildly. The sheriff's side broke every fence along his south pasture, scattered his cattle halfway to El Paso, left one of their wolf heads painted on his barn. Third ranch this month. First, it was the Miller place," Sarah added, pushing her plate away. "Wade and the Thompsons spread now. This, they're working their way down Route 62, marking their territory like actual wolves." The rumble of motorcycles grew louder through the diner windows. They watched as 6 riders from the Iron Wolves pulled into Rosa's parking lot, their chrome and leather glinting menacingly in the morning sun. Their patches showed a snarling wolf's head against a blood-red moon, a sight that had become all too familiar along the stretch of highway. Maria, Thomas called softly, "Might want to start some fresh coffee. Seems we've got company." His voice carried the same calm it had shown during countless showdowns in his younger days, when his draw was legendary and his aim true. Those days were long past, or so most folks thought. The bell above the door chimed as the first 2 riders entered, their boots heavy on the worn linoleum. The leader, a tall man they called Razor, surveyed the diner with calculated menace. His eyes settled on Thomas, noting the old man's worn holster with obvious amusement. Thomas continued sipping his coffee, seemingly unperturbed by their presence. But Sarah noticed how his right hand rested slightly closer to his hip, a gesture so subtle most wouldn't catch it. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he remained seated, acutely aware that any wrong move could spark something none of them could control. Well, Razor's voice carried artificial warmth. "What do we have here? Didn't know they still made cowboys like you, old-timer. Thought they were all in museums by now." The other bikers chuckled, spreading out through the diner with practiced intimidation. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she set fresh coffee cups on the counter, but her voice remained steady. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" "Oh, we're not here for coffee," Razor replied, his eyes never leaving Thomas, just admiring the local color. "That's quite a piece you're wearing. Grandpa family heirloom." The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the diner's floor. In the distance, more motorcycles that some legends never fade and some skills, like Thomas McCall's lightning drawer, only grew sharper with age. The Iron Wolf's presence had transformed Rosa's cafe from a comfortable haven into an arena of tension. Thomas Mull's weathered hands remained steady around his coffee cup. As Razor circled his booth, the biker's shadow falling across the worn tabletop like a gathering storm. "You didn't answer my question, old-timer." Razor pressed his voice, carrying the edge of someone used to immediate compliance. "That antique on your hip just for show? Or do you actually remember how to use it?" Sarah Chen watched from the counter, her knuckles white around her coffee cup. She'd only been teaching at Desert Springs High School for 5 years, but she'd heard the stories about Thomas McCall. The older residents spoke of him in hushed tones, tales of his legendary speed with a gun, mixing with documented fact, until it was hard to separate truth from legend. "Some things," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity it had for the 40 years he'd been coming to Rosa's. "A man doesn't forget, like respect and manners." He lifted his cup to his lips, the morning light catching the silver rings on his fingers, rings that marked achievements most of the town's younger residents had never heard about. Maria Torres moved with careful efficiency behind the counter, her movements carrying the weight of someone trying to maintain normally in an increasingly dangerous situation. Her mother had owned this cafe when Thomas was still actively working as a range detective, tracking rustlers and protecting the ranches that dotted the West Texas landscape. She'd seen firsthand what he could do with that worn Colt 45. Respect. Razor's laugh carried no humor. Times change. Gramps' Route 62 runs on different rules now. Iron Wolf's rules. He leaned closer, his leather cut creaking. And rule number 1 is understanding who's in charge. Sheriff Rodriguez watched the exchange with growing concern. As much as he respected Thomas's abilities, even at 75, the situation was becoming increasingly volatile. The Iron Wolves had been systematically taking control of every establishment along their stretch of highway, using intimidation and violence to establish their dominance. James Thomas addressed the sheriff without taking his eyes off Razor. "How's Annie doing with her barrel racing? Heard she took first place at the county fair." The seemingly casual question carried weight that only the diner regular patrons understood. Annie Rodriguez, the sheriff's daughter, had learned barrel racing from Thomas McCall himself on the same ranch where he'd once trained Lorman in the art of the quick draw. Those sessions had stopped years ago, or so most people thought. "She's doing fine, Thomas," the sheriff replied carefully. "Using those techniques you taught her, smooth and precise, just like you said." Razor's face darkened at being ignored. He moved to knock Thomas's coffee cup aside, but before his hand could connect, the old cowboy's fingers closed around his wrist. The grip, belling Thomas's age, was like iron. "Son," Thomas said quietly, "that coffee is still hot. Be a shame if anyone got burned." The other bikers tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons. But Razor, looking into Thomas's eyes, saw something that made him pause. There was no fear there, no uncertainty, just the calm assessment of a man who'd faced far worse than motorcycle gangs. Through the window, more Iron Wolves could be seen arriving, their bikes filling Rosa's parking lot. The morning sun glinted off chrome and leather, casting wolf-head shadows across the pavement. Sarah thought about her students, how the gang's presence had changed their lives. Parents were keeping their children closer to home, local businesses were closing earlier, and the vibrant community life that had defined Desert Springs was slowly being strangled by my fear. "You know what I see?" Razor recovered his composure, jerking his hand away from Thomas's grip. "I see a relic, a leftover from times that don't exist anymore. This isn't the Wild West, old man. Your kind is extinct." Thomas took another sip of his coffee, his movements unhurried. "Might be right about that," he conceded. "World's changed plenty since my day, but some things stay the same." Fame. His eyes met Rosa's, like the difference between seeming dangerous and being dangerous. The implied challenge hung in the air like smoke. Maria's hand trembled slightly as she set a fresh pot of coffee on the burner, the familiar aroma mixing with the tension that filled the diner. Outside, more Iron Wolves gathered, drawn by some instinctive sense that something significant was unfolding. "Tell me something," Thomas continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent diner. "Those wolves on your patches, did you earn them or just buy them? Because real wolves, they know better than to mistake quiet for weakness." The morning sun had climbed higher, its light catching the worn grip of Thomas's Thomas is called. The weapon wasn't just a relic of his past, it was a symbol of everything the Iron Wolves thought they'd erased from Route 62: dignity, respect, and the quiet strength of men who didn't need to prove their power through intimidation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Razor's face darkened at Thomas's words, his artificial composure cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. The other Iron Wolves shifted position in the diner, their movements carrying predatory intent. As they sensed their leaders growing anger, you want to know about earning things. Old man Razor's voice dropped dangerously. How about I show you what we've earned, boys? Give our friend here a demonstration of Iron Wolf hospitality. Before anyone could move, Thomas's voice cut through the tension like a steel blade. Sheriff might want to step outside with Sarah and Maria. Things are about to get educational in here. Despite the situation, his tone remained conversational, almost pleasant. But those who knew him recognized something in his bearing, a subtle shift from retired rancher to something else entirely. Mr. McCall, Sarah began, concern evident in her voice. But Thomas's slight smile stopped her. It wasn't the smile of a man in danger. It was the smile of a teacher about to deliver an important lesson. Now, Sarah, he said softly, some lessons need to be witnessed from a safe distance. Through the diner's windows, more Iron Wolves could be seen arriving, their bikes filling the parking lot and spilling onto Route 62. The morning sun caught their chrome and leather, creating a menacing display of power. Inside, Razormen had spread out, confident in their numerical superiority. Last chance, Cowboy. Razor sneered. Take off that gun belt, lay it on the table, and maybe we just rough you up a little. Keep it on, and we'll make an example of you. That Route 62 won't forget. Thomas carefully set his coffee cup down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Funny thing about examples, he mused, they work both ways. Been watching you boys work your way down this highway, spreading fear, thinking it makes you strong. Might be time for folks to see what real strength looks like. Boss, one of the younger wolves called out. Got something you should see. He held up a smartphone, his face showing confused recognition. Been looking up our friend here, Thomas Lightning McCall. There's stories about him from back in the day. They used to call him the ghost of Route 62. Sheriff Rodriguez finished from near the door back when he was working as a range detective. 7 shootouts, 28 arrests, and not a single casualty. They said he could disarm a man so fast the bullet was still in the chamber when the gun hit the ground. Razor laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. That was what, 40 years ago? Look at him, he can barely hold his coffee cup steady. Age is funny that way, Thomas replied, standing slowly. Makes some things harder, sure, but others. His right hand rested casually near his others. Just get smoother with practice, like judgment timing, knowing when a situation calls for speed and when it calls for wisdom. The tension in the diner had shifted. The younger wolves still projected menace, but the older ones, those who'd grown up hearing stories of the legendary lawman who once patrolled these highways, showed signs of uncertainty. Think I read about you, one of them said slowly. Weren't you the one who took down the Carson gang? 3 men armed with automatics, and you dropped them all without killing a single one. That was a lifetime ago, Thomas acknowledged back, when men who wanted to prove themselves did it face to face, not by terrorizing folks just trying to live their lives. Razor, sensing his control of the situation slipping, moved suddenly. His hand dropped to his waistband, reaching for concealed steel. But before his fingers could close around his weapon, a sound split the air, a whisper of well-oiled leather, a click of aged metal, and suddenly Thomas McCall's Colt seemed to materialize in his hand. The movement had been so smooth, so blindingly fast, that several witnesses would later swear the gun had simply appeared. Even Razor, his own weapon, only halfway drawn, froze in astonishment. Now, then, Thomas said, quietly, his aim unwavering despite his age. Seems like a good time to discuss the future of Route 62 and how it might look different from what you boys had planned. The morning sun streamed through Rosa's windows, illuminating a scene that would soon become legend in its own right. An old cowboy standing against modern-day outlaws, proving that some skills never fade and some traditions never die. But what the Iron Wolves couldn't know was that this moment wasn't just about one man's stand. It was about to become a turning point that would transform the entire region. Starting with a demonstration of speed and skill that would remind everyone why Thomas McCall had earned the name Lightning in the first place. The diner had fallen into complete silence, broken only by the idle rumble of motorcycles outside. Razor stood frozen, his hand still hovering over his half-drawn weapon, as he processed the impossible speed he just witnessed from a man old enough to be his grandfather. "That was your first mistake," Thomas said calmly, his cult remaining steady, assuming that because something's old it's weak. "Second mistake was thinking fear equals strength." His blue eyes swept the room, taking in each iron wolf with the measured assessment of a man who'd spent decades reading similar situations. "Third mistake is coming up trying to decide if you can still win this." Sarahan watched from near the door, her earlier fear replaced by amazement. In the 5 years she'd known Thomas McCall, she'd seen only the quiet rancher who occasionally visited her classroom to teach children about the area's history. Now she understood why her older students' parents spoke of him with such reverence. "You can't watch this whole highway forever, old man." Razor found his voice, though it carried less conviction than before. "We've got chapters in 3 states. This is just one diner on one stretch of road." "Interesting thing about highways," Thomas replied, his tone conversational. "Despite the tension, they connect more than just places. They connect people, stories, legends." He shifted slightly, and somehow his stance became even more commanding. "Been making some connections of my own lately." Sheriff Rodriguez understood the implication before the others. He'd seen Thomas at the Retired Rangers Association meetings, had noticed the quiet conversations with men who still carried badges and others who traded them for ranch jobs, but hadn't lost their skills. "Got a call yesterday," Thomas continued, "from an old friend down in Del Rio. Seems the Iron Wolves tried setting up there too. Tried the same intimidation ICS on another relic, retired Texas Ranger named Bill Hawkins. You boys might want to look him up, see how that worked out for your brother's." Recognition flickered across some of the older wolves' faces. The Del Rio chapter's sudden disappearance 2 months ago had been a mystery, but now pieces were falling into place. Maria Torres moved carefully behind the counter, her movements deliberate, as she reached for the old phone that hung on the wall. Like everyone else who'd grown up in the area, she knew the stories about the informal network of retired lawmen who still kept watch over Texas highways. "That's right," Maria Thomas nodded, reading her intention. "Might want to make that call we discussed. Let folks know it's time." Razor's composure cracked. "Further time for what, old man? Your senior citizen patrol time to remind everyone that some traditions don't die." Thomas replied that some men don't stop being who they are just because the world changes around them. "Each of those men your chapter's been terrorizing, they're not just victims. They're links in a chain that runs deeper and stronger than you boys can imagine." Through the diner windows, more dust could be seen rising on Road 62. But these weren't motorcycles approaching, they were pickup trucks, ranch vehicles, and the distinctive profile of police cruisers from 3 counties. "See, while you boys were building your little empire through fear," Thomas continued, his voice carrying decades of earned authority, "I've been making calls, talking to old friends, men who haven't forgotten what these highways mean, what they represent. Real wolves don't just mark territory, they protected." One of the younger wolves moved suddenly, perhaps hoping to take advantage of Thomas' divided attention. The old man's response was so smooth, so blindingly fast, that even those watching closely couldn't follow the movements. Somehow, without seeming to shift position, Thomas had drawn a second Colt covering both sides of the diner. "That's another mistake to add to the list," he said quietly, thinking speed is just for the young. What you boys don't understand is the true speed, the kind that matters, comes from something deeper than muscle. It comes from knowing deep in your bones exactly what you're capable of and exactly what you stand for." The approaching vehicles were close enough now that their details became clear. They carried men that some of the older Iron Wolves recognized, former rangers, retired sheriffs, ranch detectives who'd never quite hung up their badges. Men who, like Thomas McCall, had spent decades protecting these highways and the communities they connected. "Last chance, boys." Thomas offered his gun's unwavering way. "I see it. You've got 2 choices. You can be smart, lay down your weapons, and learn about respect the easy way, or" his smile carried no humor, "you can be like your Del R brothers and learn about it the hard way. Either way, Road 62 is about to remember what real law looks like." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the diner's IFL. In those shadows, the Iron Wolves were about to learn that cafe crystallized as the convoy of vehicles pulled into the parking lot surrounding the Iron Wolves motorcycles. Through the windows, Thomas McCall's words were proving prophetic as familiar faces emerged, men carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of longtime lawmen. "Let me tell you what's really happening here," Thomas continued, his cult steady as heartbeats. "Right now, Bill Hawkins is leading a similar group in Del Rio. Jack Martinez has another in El Paso. Remember the Carson gang I mentioned, Jack's the one who taught me about dual-wielding these Colts. He's 80 now, but his hands are still steady enough to sign death warrants or offer second chances." Razor's face contorted with a mixture of rage and dawning comprehension. His carefully constructed image of power was crumbling, replaced by the realization that he'd unknowingly challenged something far older and more organized than he'd imagined. "That's impossible," he snarled, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone watching their world revel. "You're bluffing. No way you old-timers could organize something like this." Thomas's laugh carried genuine amusement, "son. We were organizing takedowns while you were still learning to ride with training wheels. These highways, they're not just roads, they're lifelines connecting communities, families, traditions. Every diner, every ranch, every small town, they're all part of something bigger, something you boys tried to break out outside." More vehicles arrived. Sarah Chen recognized some of the men emerging from them, fathers of her students, retired lawmen who now worked as ranchers or security consultants, men who, like Thomas, carried themselves with the quiet confidence of those who'd spent their lives standing against chaos. "Know what your real mistake was?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "Thinking that because we retired we stopped being who we are. Thinking that because we chose quiet lives we forgot how to be dangerous." Maria Torres moved carefully behind the counter, her hand steady now as she poured coffee for the men filing into the diner. Each newcomer took up positions with practiced efficiency, their movements suggesting years of tactical experience. "Bill Hawkins sends his regards, a weathered man in his 70s, announced his voice, carrying the gravel of too many desert patrols. "Says to tell you the Del R chapter of the Iron Wolves sends their apologies, all 23 of them from jail." Ray's remaining bravado crumbled. "You're crazy, old man, all of you. This isn't the Wild West anymore. You can't, just can't." What Thomas cut him off. "Can't protect our own, can't stand together against men who mistake cruelty for strength." His smile carries decades of earned confidence. "Way I see it, you boys have been writing checks. Your courage can't cash. Thinking nobody would stand against you. Time to learn about real courage." Sheriff Rodriguez moved with professional authority, coordinating with the newly arrived reinforcements. The Iron Wolves found themselves facing not just Thomas McCall's legendary speed, but a carefully orchestrated response from men who'd spent their lives dealing with threats to their community unities. "Here's what happens next," Thomas announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the diner. "You boys are going to lay down your weapons slowly and carefully. Then you're going to learn about something your kind never understood, the difference between taking and earning respect." One of the younger wolves, panic overriding judgment, made a sudden move for his concealed weapon. Thomas's response was so smooth, so blindingly fast, that even those watching closely couldn't follow the movement. The young man's gun went spinning across the floor, his wrist caught in a grip that belied the old cowboy's age. "That speed," Thomas said quietly, "isn't just about quick draws anymore. It's about choosing faster than thought, between stopping a threat and offering redemption. Your choice now is simple: face charges for everything you've done along Route 62, or help us clean up the mess you've made." The morning sun streamed through Rosa's windows, illuminating a scene that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Iron Wolves' attempt to rule through fear had collided with something they couldn't: intimidate or overwhelm the unbreakable bonds of men who'd spent their lives protecting these highways and the communities they connected outside. More vehicles arrived carrying the weight of lore and tradition. The Iron Wolves were about to learn that some forces can't be broken by modern methods, some strengths don't fade with age, and some legends don't just tell stories, they remind everyone why they became legends in the first place. The breaking point had arrived, not just for the Iron Wolves, but for every outlaw group that had mistaken these quiet highways for easy territory. Thomas McCall's hand wasn't just about one diner or one stretch of road. It was about to become a turning point that would remind everyone why the old ways and the old guardians had never really gone away. The next few moments in Rosa's cafe unfolded with the precise choreography of men who'd spent lifetimes handling similar situations. Thomas McCall kept his cults trained on strategic points, while retired lawmen moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, disarming iron wolves and securing weapons. Had an interesting conversation last week, Thomas said conversationally, his aim never wavering despite his apparent casualness. Seems your chapter's been busy up in Amarillo. Too interesting thing about Amarillo, they've got their own relic up there. Man named James Running Bear, retired tribal police, runs a small diner. Now your boys thought he'd be an easy target. Raz's face showed recognition. Then concerned, the Amarillo operation had gone silent 3 days ago. With no explanation from their brothers, their running bear, Thomas continued, he's got this interesting philosophy about young wolves who don't know their place. Says sometimes they need to be taught by the old wolves who marked the territory. First Sheriff Rodriguez coordinated with the arriving reinforcements, his movements carrying the weight of official authority, backed by decades of experience. Got word from state police. He announced they're moving on Iron Wolves chapters in 3 counties. Seems our friends here have quite a record. Extortion, vandalism, assault list keeps growing. The younger wolves looked increasingly uncertain, their bravado crumbling, as they realized the true scope of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about one old cowboy in one diner. It was about an entire network of men they dismissed as relics, men who'd never stopped protecting their communities. You know what real power is, son? Thomas addressed Razor directly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. It's not about how loud your bikes are or how many people you can frighten. It's about the quiet strength of men who stand together, who remember what these highways mean, what they represent. Maria Torres moved behind the counter with renewed confidence, serving coffee to the gathered lawmen. Her hands no longer trembled. The fear that had gripped Rosa's cafe for months was dissolving in the presence of real strength. Your daddy, Thomas continued, his eyes fixed on Razor. He worked the oil fields, didn't he? Hard man, tough job. Betty taught you about respect, about earning your place. Somewhere along the way, you forgot those lessons. Started thinking fear was the same as strength. The mention of his father hit Razor like a physical blow. His face showed a flicker of something beyond anger or fear, perhaps the first glimpse of recognition, of understanding how far he'd strayed from the values he'd been raised with. Sarah Chin watched from near the door, grading papers forgotten in her hands, as she witnessed what would surely become local legend. Her students' parents had told stories about the old guardians of Route 62, but seeing them in action, seeing how their quiet strength could overcome modern threats, was something else entirely. Got another call coming, and one of the retired rangers announced his phone displaying messages from across the region, chapters falling in 3 states. Seems our friends here didn't realize how many relics were watching, waiting, remembering what real law looks like. Thomas's stance shifted slightly, though his aim remained perfect. Time to make a choice, boys. Way I see it, you've got it. 2 paths ahead. One leads through every courthouse in 3 states, facing charges that'll keep you riding prison yards instead of highways. Other path. He paused, his voice carrying the hint of hope that one's harder, but it leads somewhere better. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting stark shadows across Rosa's floor. In those shadows, the Iron Wolves faced a moment of truth, not just about their immediate future, but about the very nature of strength and respect. Your bikes, Thomas continued, they're not just machines, they're freedom-powered brotherhood. But you boys twisted that turned something noble into something ugly. Question is, are you ready to remember what real brotherhood looks like? Outside, more vehicles arrived. Not just law enforcement now, but ranchers, business owners, community leaders who'd suffered under the Iron Wolves' reign of terror. They came not for revenge, but to witness the moment when their highways would be reclaimed by men who understood the true meaning of protection. Last chance, Thomas announced, his voice carrying the finality of judgment. Choose your path, show these highways, whether you're wolves or just pups playing at being dangerous. The moment stretched like wire under tension, ready to either snap or reshape itself into something new. Route 62 and all the communities it connected waited to see which path the Iron Wolves would choose, and what that choice would mean for the future of their shared roads and shared destiny. The diner's phone rang, cutting through the tension like a steel blade. Maria Torres answered it, her voice steady. As she handed it to Thomas McCall without lowering either cult, he activated the the speakerphone, letting everyone hear the graveled voice that emerged. Lightning, it's running be up in Amarillo. Got your message networks activated. Every retired lawman from here to El Paso is either on the road or coordinating with local authorities. Like old times, Brother Thomas's slight smile carried decades of shared history. Just like Laro in 82, James, remember what you told me then about wolves and territory running bears? Laugh carried through the speaker. Old wolves might get gray, but their teeth stay sharp. My boys have already rounded up the Amarillo chapter. Seems these young pups forgot that real wolves protect their territory, not just market. Razor's face showed growing comprehension as he realized the true extent of what his gang had stumbled into. This wasn't just about one old cowboy or one diner. It was about an entire network of men who'd never stopped watching, never stopped protecting their communities. Got Bill Hawkins on the other line. Running Bear continued, says Delrose Secure Martinez has El Paso locked down. The old network never died. Lightning just went quiet, waiting for the right moment. Sarah Chen watched in amazement as more vehicles arrived outside Rosa's cafe. Each carried men who moved with the unmistakable bearing of experienced lawmen. Some retired, some still active, all responding to a call that transcended official channels. Tell them about Laredo. One of the older Iron Wolves spoke up, suddenly surprising everyone. My uncle was there, told me stories about how a handful of rangers and local lawmen stood against 50 cartel members. Said there was one man, they called him Lightning. That's ancient history. Thomas cut in, though his eyes showed appreciation for the recognition. Today's about writing new history, about showing these highways what real protection looks like. Sheriff Rodriguez coordinated with the arriving reinforcements, his radio crackling with updates from across 3 states. The Iron Wolves' carefully constructed empire was crumbling, not under the assault of rival gang or federal authorities, but under the coordinated response of men they dismissed as relics. Networks reporting activity all along Route 62. A retired ranger announced, checking his phone. Every chapter's being contained. Sons and grandsons of old lawmen joining in, making their own legacy. This isn't just about stopping them anymore. It's about showing them a better way. Thomas kept his cult steady, but his voice carried a teacher's patience. You boys thought you were building something, thought fear and intimidation could give you control, but real control, real respect that comes from protecting, not threatening, from standing together, not standing over others. Maria Torres served fresh coffee to the gathering of loremen. Her movements carrying new confidence through the diner windows. More dust clouds approached, not just law enforcement now, but regular citizens, community members drawn by word of what was unfolding. Running Bear Thomas spoke into the phone. Remember what you used to say about redemption, about how even the youngest wolf can learn new ways. Still believe it? Lightning question is, do these young ones want to learn? Do they want to understand what real strength looks like? The morning sun cast long shadows across R's floor as Thomas McCall faced the Iron Wolves, his stance unwavering. Despite his age, this moment wasn't just about ending their reign of terror. It was about offering them a choice, a chance to understand the true meaning of the power they'd misused. Network standing by. Running Bear's voice carried authority, even through the speaker. Every old guardian from here to the state line is ready, just like the old days when we kept these highways safe, not through fear, but through something stronger. Outside, the gathering of vehicles and men had transformed Rosa's parking lot into a demonstration of quiet strength. These weren't just retired lawmen responding to a threat, they were guardians awakening to remind everyone that some traditions never die, some bonds never break, and some men never stop protecting what matters. The Iron Wolves faced a moment of truth, surrounded by men who'd spent lifetimes understanding the difference between seeming dangerous and being truly strong. The network that had awakened wasn't just about enforcement. It was about transformation, about showing younger generations that real power comes from protection, not intimidation. The morning air in Rosa's cafe crackled with tension as Razor faced the moment that would define not just his future, but the future of every Iron Wolf present. Thomas McCall's Colts remained unwavering, but his eyes carried something beyond threat, an offer of understanding, of potential redemption. Your father, Thomas, said quietly, addressing Razor with unexpected gentleness, worked the Henderson oil fields, didn't he? Joe Martinez, tough man, honest worker, used to stop